Welcome to the HCD Podcast Mindset, your ultimate destination for exploring behavioral science, neuromarketing, and consumer research. I'm your host, Michelle Nagella, and I'm thrilled to have you join us for today's curious conversation to ignite your curiosity and provide you with a wealth of insights. Today, I'm joined by HCD's own Manager of Global Research and Consulting, Sophia Stafford. Join us on a journey where we unravel the mysteries behind consumer emotions and perceptions as we discuss consumer reactions as they navigate through the dynamic experience with products. From the initial spark of interest to the final moment of use, Sensory Journey Mapping offers unprecedented insights into the intricate dance between consumers and the products they love. But before we plunge into the depths of our conversation, I do urge you to take a moment to like and subscribe to this podcast, ensuring you never miss an episode filled with thought-provoking content. And don't forget to explore the wealth of resources available, including white papers, conference presentations, and more on our website, www.hcdi.net. So whether you're commuting, working out, or simply unwinding, let's embark on another enlightening journey of knowledge and discovery right here on HCD's Mindset. Hey, Sophia, how are you doing?
I'm good, Michelle. How are you doing?
So glad to have you join back with us to have this conversation.
Yes, always a good time.
So we decided to have a conversation about this sensory journey mapping because I've noticed that it just keeps coming up, right?
Yes. Yeah. In so many different product or like categories in general too. So it's something that we've been having a lot of conversations with just different clients from all walks of life for sure.
Yeah. And it just seems to really fit with sort of the questions that our people seem to be having.
Mhm.
So like a lot of times people seem to be really like a term that comes up a lot is moments of truth, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So what do you think that these clients mean when they're talking about moments of truth?
Yeah, and I think it all kind of goes back to this idea that the industry is shifting from very obviously controlled experiments have a place and a time, but also wanting to get that very naturalistic behavior. And I think that's what those moments of truth really are, especially when you're talking about product usage that is maybe multiple times a day or multiple times over a week. I think that this kind of methodology has a really cool opportunity to look a little bit deeper into the naturalistic behaviors while like seamlessly kind of integrating it into what they're already doing, what consumers are already doing, right? Because a lot of the times with naturalistic behaviors and like ethnographies and things like that, we often run into disrupting that behavior. We want to minimize that disruption as much as possible. So I think that this type of methodology has a lot of potential to maybe be that like seamless integration that consumers are already doing within their daily lives.
Agreed. And I'm just going to pull up something here. So just putting on the screen now, um, this, can you see it by chance?
Mhm.
Yeah. So this is just like a little infographic that I made to kind of talk about this idea a little bit, and we can kind of talk through it. And I think you have a case study that we can use.
Mhm.
But this is something we've been sharing on social media. So this is called sensory journey mapping. And it really is about that idea of creating consistent consumer experiences, right? Because when we think about the way consumers interact with products, it's not just in like these one singular moment sort of experiences. They experience it over time, they experience it over the course of a day. So
Mhm.
they have a product journey that they go through. Maybe it's at the beginning of product use, maybe it's in the middle or the end, and that the sensory information that they're getting can change over time. But also, just if it's the time of day, even maybe your first use of a product is different than your last use of a product. And so kind of stealing a little bit from the qualitative approach of journey mapping, right? Or the
Mhm.
behavioral approach of journey mapping, where you're, very qualitatively looking, just sort of, you know, observing the way someone interacts with a product and being able to say that, oh, they seem happy here, and these are sort of challenges they face. We
Mhm.
can use our sort of very implicit psychological take on that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I also
Mhm.
think
Oh, go
this
ahead.
is and you can see here that we're thinking of using implicit and SAM for this type of methodology. And for those who don't know, implicit association testing is that automatic association within our semantic memory that we can test through reaction time. And then the self-assessment mannequin is measuring that three-dimensional kind of emotional landscape of pleasure, arousal, and dominance. And both of those measures were pulled from psychological academic literature.
Yeah. And so
And what I
implicit is
really,
very much like how someone is interpreting that moment, right? So
Mhm.
like perceptually what they're getting. And then self-assessment mannequin is just very much like how they're feeling in that moment. But both measures are really about that precise moment, what you're perceiving, what you're feeling. And we're trying to find a way of measuring that that's not so explicit, right? So we're not really trying to, interrupt with any sort of bias or anything like that.
Yeah, and it also might be really hard for some consumers to even articulate these types of things, these type of higher order psychological emotional benefits that go along with very typically mundane products. So if you think about something like air care, it might be really difficult for consumers to really talk to how in this specific moment during this morning occasion, for example, how this fragrance is making them feel, or how these different types of emotions or how in control they're feeling, all of that. It could be really difficult for them to quickly articulate that information, which is where this kind of approach really shines and really kind of outperforms others that we've considered.
I think air care is a really interesting one because I've certainly heard um, clients talk to us about, the differences that can happen, from when you first spray an air
Mhm.
care product or maybe when you first plug in a plug-in, that experience of the first use actually changes over time. And since it's something that's supposed to stay there, right, over
Mhm.
time, you keep it in your house until it runs out. But, a big complaint people have with those kind of products is that maybe towards the end of its life, it starts to wane a little bit, or
Mhm.
maybe people get very accustomed to it and sort of forget it's there. And so being able to sort of understand what those experiences really mean seems to be a big question in
Yeah.
the fragrance space.
Yeah, and tying it back to the whole naturalistic idea, obviously with specifically air care and a lot of other products in that category, how consumers perceive and how they emotionally feel when they're at home using these products is going to be very, very different than when they are in a very controlled CLT central location type of environment, because it's just not the area that they're in when they're typically using these products. They don't have the other smells that are in their home kind of combating the air freshener that they're using, things like that. So I think that this is a really cool seamless integration, but also really helps with that idea of naturalistic understanding the emotions and the sensory attributes that are really coming out at each specific moment, like you were talking about throughout the day.
Yeah, and when we think about what journey mapping is, at its core, like the original purpose of journey mapping, it is about trying to visualize in a way that helps, maybe organizations or clients or companies identify and understand the experiences that maybe a customer is having. I think a
Mhm.
lot of times it's used in like shopping, right?
Mhm.
So, when a customer comes into a store, what is the shopping journey that they take from trying to find their product to, choosing the product and then taking it to the register and then taking it home. But usually that journey is just that one little part. And, so they're trying to find ways to improve any of the little parts, right?
Mhm.
So maybe it's this moment, which is, finding the product on the shelf, or this moment that is like, at the register, improving it in some sort of way. And so there's been some really interesting research recently about how like sensory can play a role in that. Like so if there's music that's playing, how does that affect people's mood as they first come
Mhm.
into a store, or maybe the lights, or whether or not there's someone greeting them or whatever it
Mhm.
might be. And I think there is something really similar to that when we think of it in terms of like a sensory journey map. So if we think we were just talking about air care, but maybe we take another product, maybe it's like a beverage, right?
Mhm.
So like, let's think how that might look, because this is about being able to visualize it, right? And be able to, pick out these sort of key moments. And for those of you that can see the screen, because I know some people listen to this in their car, we do have sort of a table up that shows, words for each moment. We have a sensory implicit with sensory descriptive words, And then we have an emotional implicit that has like the words that they associate for how they feel. And then we have the SAM association, which is their PAD emotional response. So PAD means pleasure, arousal, and dominance, as we've mentioned before. And so, being able to map out how that dynamic changes over time can certainly give you some information that's really helpful. So maybe there is something, if this beverage or food or whatever it might be, that, when you first use it, it's very bright and fresh and light. And then maybe you also feel very joyful in that first moment. So there's like, a real increase in pleasure, and it's exciting. So you have an increase in arousal. But this could be very different towards, the middle of the product, where maybe things start to take a little bit of a dip. Maybe you start to get more of that fruity sensory part, or maybe a more relaxed or freeing feeling. But maybe the pleasure goes down a little bit. So, it might be about being able to figure out, well, what's going on along this journey that we can sort of tease apart and say, well, can we make this better? Or is it conveying the message overall that we're trying to convey? I mean, certainly with that, last moment, whatever the person is left with, is it going to match, the experience that they were having at the front of the experience, right?
Yeah, or even fulfilling the needs that they want at that moment, because obviously the last, whatever that product experience is at the last point of the day, you're in a very different place than you were at the beginning of the day. So those needs could even be different from moment to moment. But I kind of want to talk a little bit about this idea of seamless integration. So how we're able to kind of meet the consumer where they are and minimize the disruption as much as possible, because I think that's a really important piece of this type of methodology. Obviously the sensory and the emotional outputs that we get from it are really impactful and can provide a lot of data driven responses from consumers. But what about this idea that we're able to kind of really meet the consumer where they are and kind of, have them evaluate a product in that moment where they're that minimal disruption with how they're actually using that product or experiencing that product. So we've been using some customized survey platforms that were able to actually create like about, I would say, maybe like a 5-minute survey that's super quick to implement on a consumer's iPhone or Android, whatever device they're using that they already have in their hand. And then this idea of the environment capture, Michelle, I don't know if you want to go into that a little bit more, but I think that's a really cool first step for this type of method.
Yeah. So it's not for everything, right? So there are certainly product experiences where it's not going to give you a lot of information for someone to take a picture of it, but also being able to visualize it through your phone. So sort of in conversations internally, just thinking about how like AR works and really trying to focus on the frictionless, non-invasive part of our lives. And we understand that we're all like on our phones all the time, right? And that, we kind of see the world through our phone to some degree. I mean, we scan and take pictures all the time with our phones. And so in this, it could be that we do want to see where the person is, maybe when they're experiencing this, are they, you want to check, for example, if it is maybe a nicotine product, right, that you're trying to quit smoking, or maybe it's a beverage, or maybe it's gum or candy or whatever it might be, wherever you're using it. Maybe you take a picture of that, so it's added information for context, so it can help us understand better where the person is. But it also plays a little bit of role in compliance as well, right? So like when you have people doing a survey, on their own as a HUT, as it's called, or a home use test. Of course, it doesn't have to be in the home, it can be in their car, it could be at work, or wherever they're using this product. You don't have a lot of control. And so ensuring that they are actually, using the product that you have asked them to, and that you're paying them to actually use and evaluate, you can use like a feature that not only are you gathering that information, but they're also answering the survey and seeing the product through their phone. So it's not like they break away from the product in order to answer any of these survey questions. They can actually see it. And that can be really important as far as like incorporating it into like an AR sort of aspect. So it's augmented into their existing reality in that way. And that sort of keeps it fresh. Now, we did do a study a few years ago in partnership with the MBDS program at University of Pennsylvania with some students there, where we were kind of testing out this technology. We had them go into stores. We recruited people to go into stores and actually shop for products. And so they had to, take a picture of the store on the outside and report how they felt in that moment. And then they had to try to find the product and take a picture of the shelf and look at the shelf, through the lens and actually answer the questions, the self-assessment mannequin, while looking at it, and then find the product, et cetera, and so on. We found some really interesting results. And the interesting thing, and the reason why you want to incorporate, being able to see where they actually are, is because we saw a huge effect of context. And I think that that's really important to this journey mapping as well, because, as we could see, like, sort of the emotions that they had walking into the store impacted how they perceived products inside the store. And that was really kind of cool, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so knowing that, like, that journey, whatever happens on the front end of that journey, can certainly impact, their feelings of satisfaction towards the end of the journey. That's really important to be able to, like, kind of tease apart and say, well, what's going wrong here and how can we address that? I think that's kind of why this has been really popular, because I think a lot of those questions, like, we understand that people aren't static, that
Right.
they are sort of dynamic and changing along with the moments, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that kind of brings up another point of how do we even define these moments going into the research, right? We want to uncover these different consumer driven moments by asking the consumer what their journey is throughout that process. But if we're putting this study together, how do we kind of start from the moments and then work from there if we haven't even gotten that data from the consumers yet? And I think that there's kind of two ways that we can approach that. One, we can always do some pre-work, some upfront work, where we really are kind of exploring those different moments throughout a specific product category or product journey. So that way we're very sure going into this consumer journey mapping that we are hitting on all the moments that are consumer defined. The opposite side of that is we can kind of look into a moment exploration. So picking some general time frames or time of day that we would typically see this product being used, or throughout the week, maybe, very flexible there, but we can kind of define the moments as they come in that case, which is kind of two different approaches. One obviously is a little bit more recommended than the other. But I think this obviously comes with a lot of nuances and new ideas around how this could work. So it's not always very realistic to assume that we can do a lot of that upfront work where we are defining what those moments are for a consumer. But it's always good to make sure that we're not relying on our own internal knowledge or things like that, because how consumers are defining things are going to be very different from the category experts, and how we are thinking about things as people that are actually studying these products.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to talk about, just, that this is very collaborative from our perspective. Like, how do you, go into this? Yes, this is a prescribed sort of methodology we're talking about. We're using Simplicit, which is our self-assessment mannequin, with our implicit. We combine it together. And we're talking about sensory journey mapping, which again is our way of looking at the experience over time for the consumer. But since I think each product experience and each sort of situation is so different, this is like a huge conversation that we have with our clients. It's often very collaborative, or it's something that we workshop, to understand, well, what's some of the information that the client already has. So a lot of times they've already done a lot of qual research, where maybe they do have language there on what those moments are. Some clients call it occasions and not moments, and some clients have sort of different words for how they describe these things, but they may have the actual data there. And so by doing pre-activation workshops, we can sort of better understand how to design the research in the most effective way.
Yeah, and it seems like a really rudimentary step, that pre-activation, or that really just kind of getting everyone on the same page before you start one of these innovative methodologies, or kind of like first in industry applications. But what you really gain from that is the confidence going into this consumer journey mapping or sensory journey mapping, that the data that we're getting out of it is not going to be, we're on the right page of the moments that we've defined because we have that data to back it up. Now we can really focus on the emotions and the sensory attributes, and that SAM kind of dynamic coming out, to really understand what's happening at a consumer level, instead of kind of getting to the end of the study and being like, oh, wow, I wish we kind of had different moments because these moments that we chose really aren't resonating with the consumers. This is not how they're using the product. It's kind of how we think that they're using the product.
I have a question for you, Sophia. So
Mhm.
given that, this kind of started off with talking about how this has just come up in conversation quite a bit
Mhm.
recently. And it's kind of interesting that, okay, journey mapping is not new. It's been around for a while. Self-assessment mannequin, been around for quite
Mhm.
some time. Implicit association, been around for quite some time. Why do you think this is like such a tool now that just seems to
Mhm.
make sense? Like, why is this?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it's two sides. So one, I think the industry is really pushing for more behaviorally implicit driven data insights to really make decisions. And I think that push is coming from a lot of bigger companies. And so everyone's trying to kind of get on board with that and move as quickly as possible. But obviously, with that, as we were talking about, with kind of skipping that pre-activation workshop, a lot of it is kind of just jumping right into the deep end and not really understanding what exactly they're getting into before actually applying these methods.
Hmm.
So I think the reason it's kind of coming up now is all of these companies are starting to understand how they can incorporate behavioral science. They want to see this naturalistic behavior, but they know maybe the traditional methods that are coming with behavior and natural observation have, some nuances, and every measure has some cons as well as some pros. But I think the idea of kind of mixing and matching methods from traditional as well as more academic, psychological, behavioral disciplines is definitely trending now, and something that a lot of companies have been hearing about but don't necessarily know how to actually apply it to what they're doing every day. So I think that it's a lot of conversations about it, but I don't think it's really been done quite all that often, at least specifically in this
Hmm.
application of it. So I think it's kind of the trendiness of the whole idea of behavioral neuroscience within industry research, as well as kind of companies are already starting to dip their toe in it, but how can we kind of make this a little bit more applicable to the business need that's happening right now? And obviously, once one person jumps on board, all the other companies need to now understand the consumer journey mapping or the sensory journey mapping, or these moments of truth that we're talking about. It's just been something that's been coming up all the time.
Do you think that there's also been like increased interest in a home use test? Like people like kind of favoring getting out of the CLT and trying to be more
Mhm.
naturalistic, maybe?
Yeah, I think it's more companies are realizing the faults that come with that CLT type of test. And yes, it is very helpful for when you need a controlled environment. So when you are doing maybe something like very specific fragrance testing, where you need to understand what exactly this fragrance is telling us, not the whole experience
Or
itself.
like trying to do real differentiation, because I think people are better at differentiation when they're in a very isolated, clean environment,
Mhm.
right? But when
Right.
like you're in your natural environment in your home where you would use it, there's
Yeah.
lots of other stuff going on, so it can be harder to discriminate, right?
Yeah. And I think a lot of companies are realizing that their CLT data that they're getting, or the results that they're getting, aren't really matching up with that actual experience that consumers are having once the product goes to market. There are some companies that like whatever their product is performs really, really well in a CLT environment, but then when they go to market with it, it's just not, those results just aren't matching up. So
Yeah.
they're shifting to something that maybe is a little bit more realistic or a little bit more reflective of that full product experience. Because yes, while all the components of the product do matter and we want all of them to be great and well liked and all of that, the whole experience is what the consumer is going through, right? And that's kind of
Mhm.
what we need to focus on to understand this journey throughout the product usage, and kind of where are the gaps in our knowledge, and how can we kind of better suit this product for specifically this moment that we're looking for.
And so I think a lot of times, you're talking about like the consumer experience, and I think a lot of times people just measure it holistically. So,
Mhm.
they'll just ask at the end, like, well, how did you feel about it? Or
Mhm.
maybe we could do an implicit, we could do a SAM at the end of the product experience. Um, but we have just seen recently in some studies where, when we looked at the journey, we had this like dynamic thing going on, I think if you think it just like you choose the product, you maybe open it, or you see it, you open it, you smell it,
Mhm.
you actually use it. Each of those stages was quite different. And none of them really totally matched that
Mhm.
overall experience when you ask them at the end, and you say, oh, well, what'd you think of the whole thing?
Mhm, mhm.
And they gave a completely different answer. What do you think is going on there?
Well, I think it goes back to what you were talking about with context. I think the overall experience has a lot more playing into it than just the small components that make up that experience, right? So even if you think about branding,
Mm,
branding is the first thing that consumers are going to see when they're in the store buying a product. And that automatically is going to add some of that context and affect all of the other perceptions that they're going to have with the product from here on out. So I think that the CLT is really great for understanding those nuances and getting that differentiation, like you were talking about. But the understanding the full experience and that holistic idea, there is a lot of context that needs to be taken in and understood by companies, and understanding how their product is meeting the branding expectations or how their branding is affect that product experience.
mm.
That dynamic, as well as the context of them being the consumers being in their own personal environment, I think plays a lot into that changing dynamic of the individual components of a product versus that holistic experience.
Yeah. I think also when we're talking about holistic experiences, and since we are, naming this as not just being journey mapping, but sensory journey mapping, I think a lot of times we forget that our product experiences are multisensory, right?
Mhm,
So
mhm,
while we might be focusing on fragrance when we're talking about, home air care, right? Everybody's focused on just that, what the fragrance is eliciting, that maybe we aren't really thinking about the other components of that,
mhm,
that set up your expectations. So considering even the color of the packaging,
mhm,
the actual color of the plug-in, or even the sounds that it makes, or just all of these different sort of steps that everything we experience, toothpaste, shampoo, it's all multisensorial. We have color,
mhm.
we have texture, which people forget about texture.
Yeah, right. And isn't there something with, and I might be wrong here, but isn't there something with the more senses that you touch on, the more emotionally it resonates with consumers? Am I on
Yeah,
the
there's some work out there that suggests that. So I think what we do know is that people connect with brands,
Mhm,
through, sort of bonding with the experiences that they have. And so the more communications you kind of have that are consistent and differentiated from your competitors,
mhm,
that, that's just going to strengthen that bond. So you're more likely to be brand loyal.
mhm,
So we know that if you increase those number of connections, that you actually increase sort of the emotionality of the experience. So
mhm,
if it's not just a fragrance, but you've also incorporated in like the color into your branding. So now you have like a recognizable, that this product is known for this type of fragrance and this type of color, and this types of texture, that all those things together as a holistic experience, they're like, oh, this is this brand, right?
mhm, mhm.
And they're more likely to bond through having that, like, more communications. It's like we call it sort of like a 5D experience, because you have
Yeah.
these 5 dimensions of senses, and like, why not use them?
Right, right. And that kind of also goes back to the whole idea of sensory journey mapping. That might be something that you can really target in this type of approach. That sensory footprint is what we call it, and kind of how you can, because it might be hard for some companies to really understand what their sensory footprint even is and what
And it
aspects of their
changes
product.
over time.
Right, exactly.
Right? So the
Where can
sensory
we
footprint is the idea that you're mapping out, well, which of the senses, taste, smell, visual, texture, all these different things, like, well, what is hitting high notes, right?
Mhm,
And if you would like to think of any brand like Coca-Cola, you might say, oh, well, taste. But Coca-Cola is not so much iconic for the taste as it is for the branding, right? So you
mhm,
recognize the red color, the shape of the bottle. So like, but that's at different points in the product experience, right? So maybe that up front, you would say that, oh, it's really strong in visual. And
mhm,
then, when you open it up, oh, there's a distinct sound that is not just soda, but it sounds like Coca-Cola,
mhm.
because like the amount of fizz that Coca-Cola
Yeah,
has. And then, you have the smell, which is again, like, you're going to recognize, is this Pepsi or Coke? You're probably going to be able to differentiate, so
yeah.
the dynamics of what sensory is coming out is changing over the product experience. Still, you finally get to the taste, which is supposed to be the most iconic, but really that doesn't come until later, right?
Right, right. Yeah, there's so many different experiences that happen before you even taste the Coke.
Right.
Who knew it was that complicated? But it really is when you break it down, and it's how you can kind of understand your consumer to its core, right?
Yeah.
That's how you get more information aside from that very traditional CLT evaluation.
Yeah.
Which again kind of goes back to that whole idea of home use tests kind of rising a bit in popularity.
Yeah. And I think you also want to make sure that, yes, it's good for like something to be standing out at each one of those stages, right? So it's
Mhm.
great that like color is coming out, or it's great that, the texture is coming out at these different stages. But you also want to make sure it marries back to what your intentions are.
Mhm, mhm,
But not just in liking, right? But also that it's conveying what you want the product to do. So if it is a shampoo and it's supposed to be moisturizing, you don't want that smell to be suddenly signaling drying, right? Or that
mhm,
the texture is, coarse in a way that it's going to make someone again think that it's drying when your overall product is supposed to be moisturizing.
mhm,
So I
mhm.
think that's why it's important to not just think about, yes, the emotional response is supposed to be going certain directions, but I think the perceptions that you're getting for each one of those sensory inputs should also add back in, right?
Mhm,
And
mhm.
add something to the overall experience.